Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Health in the Public Interest weekly seminar. Before we get going, I want to mention that there are two dates coming up, October 26th and November 2nd, when we have no regular seminar despite the usual Wednesday schedule. This is because there are two opportunities for special talks that we're encouraging our students to go to. Actually requiring them to go to. One of them is the farmed out panel discussion on FDA, and that's going to be on October 28th, I believe. We're going to put links to these things.
October 18th.
October 18th. Yeah, I have the second digit right. October 18th, and you can go to farmedout.org and you can find a link to that. The second one is at 2 p.m. today. So this is at the Law Center or on Zoom. It requires advanced registration. We encourage everybody to go to that as well. It's about the opioid crisis by the authors of American Cartel, investigative reporters at the Washington Post. So we do encourage you to do that. I see that Patricia at Farmed Out has put that link up for the Farmed Out panel. And Patricia, if you would be so kind as to put up the O'Neill Symposium this afternoon, that would be great too. So again, welcome. The Health in the Public Interest program is a program, an MS program, which emphasizes social aspects of public health and in fact, social determinants of health. And our speaker today is going to reflect our interest in bringing you important things that don't always get considered when we talk about public health. And so I've made an effort to kind of expand this seminar series to include more about the about social determinants, including gun violence. So you're going to be hearing about that today. We'll have a more formal introduction by Emma Rudd momentarily. I just want to say that we're going to run this seminar as follows. First of all, we're going to start out with everyone muted unless the speaker invites you to unmute. We'll stay muted until roughly a quarter of the hour, followed by a question and answer session. First, we'll accept questions from students, and then we'll move to the more general audience. And we definitely want to get in those more general audience questions because you're a very valuable part of this weekly seminar series and actually why we hold it online, so we can have so many distinguished and interested people online. So with any further introduction, Emma will do the introduction of the speaker.
Awesome. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Dr. Benjamin Dowd-Arrow serves as a director of the bachelor's program in public health at Florida State University. His research examines the mechanisms of inequality for health and well-being outcomes. This work has ranged from racial disparities in vaccination rates among adolescents, the role of religion on cognitive decline, and the factors that influence firearm ownership and firearm policy support. Much of his recent research examines the impact that firearms play on measures of health and well-being, such as happiness, fear, and sleep quality. His published research has resulted in numerous interviews with outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Trace, and with Reuters and AP. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Benjamin Dowd-Arrow.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get that up. To launch. There we go. So as Emma said, I am Benjamin Dowd-Arrow, and I'm the director of the Bachelor's in Public Health at Florida State University, and I am predominantly a gun scholar. I study firearms and health outcomes and the social determinants of firearms. And I have titled this talk, The Uniquely American Epidemic, Guns, Public Health, and Well-Being. So our agenda for today is going to look kind of like this. I'm going to go through how guns kind of look in society, where they're at, who has them. Then we're going to move into the risk posed by guns. Then we're going to talk about well-being, what it is and how it connects to firearms. Then we're going to talk about a risk that I'm specifically not going to talk about when I'm talking about risks that guns pose. Then we're going to move into what prevents us from really having a more well-rounded understanding of the role that firearms play in society, and end with the ways that we all can contribute to reducing some of these numbers. So if everybody's ready to get started, we can move into the talk. So the first thing that we need to do is really determine whether guns represent a public health issue. And I'm going to ask you just to think about this as we go along, talking about the role of guns in society. So first off, there are a lot of guns in the world. There's an estimated 1.013 billion or million guns in the world. So about 1 billion guns. And most of these guns are in the hands of private citizens, or roughly 85% of the world's guns to be exact, which means about 857 million firearms are in the hands of civilians worldwide. Now, this includes legal and illegal owners. If we think about the militaries, only about 133 million firearms are in their hands, and law enforcement only holds roughly 23 million firearms. When we look at the United States alone, we hold 393 million of these 857 million firearms that are in civilians' hands. That means roughly 46%, and it's super important here, might have something to do with that amendment that I showed on the first slide. In fact, we own more guns per capita than any country in the world. The next closest would be war-torn Yemen. We own about double the guns that they do. The guns that are out there, we can see roughly 1 in 3 households own guns, roughly 1 in 4 individuals. About a quarter of those individuals that own those guns, they're personal guns. They're not like the family's guns. Men are more likely to be the gun owner, while women are more likely to live in a home with a gun they don't own. Roughly 18% of women live in a house where someone owns a gun that's not them. And most people have fired a gun before 18. And that includes those who grew up in homes that had guns and homes that did not. About 76% of those who grew up in homes with guns had guns that they fired as children, and 61% of those who grew up in homes without guns did the same thing. Now, when we look at where gun ownership is concentrated, it's mostly held among people who are white, middle-aged, middle-class, conservative men living in the rural South. And it is especially concentrated among conservative evangelicals. During the pandemic, though, gun ownership changed and it grew. We saw a rapid growth in the gun industry. In fact, there are now growing concerns in public health about how gun sales have skyrocketed during the course of the pandemic. So in 2020, we saw gun sales increase about 64% over 2019. And during the first quarter of 2021, gun sales increased another 18% over the first quarter of 2020. So this has led journalists to ask scholars such as myself if we're in an arms race against ourselves. Now, in 2021, we published a study examining how gun ownership changed during the pandemic, and we used data that was gathered for us by the National Opinion Research Center. And what we did was we looked at who was buying guns. And what we found was that the pandemic tended to lend itself to gun purchasers who were male, younger, US born, less educated, recently unemployed, experiencing changes in their religious beliefs, Republican, and residents of southern states. Now, most of this is expected as it lines up with our previous understandings of where gun ownership is concentrated, but we found 3 characteristics that were relatively new and not really seen before, and that was youth, nativity status, and religious volatility. So what do these findings mean? Well, if we take a look at the known findings that are corroborated with people experiencing financial distress wanting to become gun owners, we can see that our findings lined up with that past research has said that white men in particular will turn to guns to reify their power status if they're experiencing financial difficulties. But the changes that we found are fascinating in that gun ownership skewed younger during the pandemic, and it was mostly concentrated among those who were born in the United States. This could be because the pandemic not only brought this disease that kind of crippled our economy, but it also brought civil and political unrest. And as a culture, we have internalized myths that suggest that guns can keep us safe from harm. And we're going to look at those myths a little bit later in this talk. But for right now, what we're concentrated with is how younger American men are turning to guns in times of uncertainty. And this includes religious uncertainty, where those experiencing drastic changes to their beliefs by either becoming more religious or less religious are buying guns. And just thinking about how those who experience drastic decline, when we think about religion, one of the roles is that it gives us faith. Our faith gives us hope. It allows us to get through hard times. If you suddenly have a drastic decline in that faith, and we consider the fact that deaths in the United States to guns are not really homicides, they're suicides, could we expect to see a rise in suicides in coming years? Now, as I've just mentioned, in the United States, most of our gun deaths are suicides, but around the world, globally, most gun deaths are homicides, and there are roughly 250,000 gun deaths a year. So this averages to a rate of about 4 per 100,000 people. 2/3 of these are homicides, and in 2016, 64% of the global gun deaths were homicides, 27% were suicides, and 9% were accidental. In the United States, though, we have seen a drastic increase in gun deaths, climbing from 35,800 in 1990 to 39,707 in 2019. That's a rate of 12.1 per 100,000. And the majority of these deaths, as I mentioned, are suicides. Gun suicides have risen 12.5% over the same time period. And in 2019 alone, there were 23,941 firearm suicides. When we look at gun deaths globally, El Salvador has the highest global gun death rate at 40 per 100,000 people, and Singapore has the lowest with 0.1 death per 100,000. But on a daily basis, the gun deaths that we see from accidents, suicides, and homicides in cities around the world outnumbers the deaths from combat and terrorism in every year, except in 1994, when the Rwandan genocide occurred and 800,000 people were killed. Now, when we start asking, why do people own guns? The most common reason that people provide is for protection. And as you can see in this Pew Research poll, 67% of people say that they own a gun primarily for protection. And in our own research, we found similar. So in that data that we collected from the National Opinion Research Center during the pandemic, we found that 66% of respondents said the primary reason they own a gun was for protection. But when we think about protection, the use of self-defense is exceedingly rare. A study by David Hemingway from Harvard puts the number of times that a gun has been used in self-defense at less than 1%. And when we look at where it's concentrated, it's mostly among males in rural areas outside of the home, against male offenders and against offenders with a gun. And this study is consistent with nearly every other study done on firearms self-defense use in crime. And all of those find that right around 1% is the actual rate. But when we start looking at the idea of who is at risk for being a victim of homicide or violence, that opens the door to quite a few different groups. So first, women are at the, if I can get that to come up, are at one of the highest risks. Women in the US are 16 times more likely to be killed with a gun than women in other high-income countries, making this country the most dangerous in the world among comparable nations when it comes to gun violence against women. The presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation increases the likelihood that the woman will be killed by 5 times. In any average month, 50 American women are shot to death by intimate partners, and many more are injured. Nearly 1 million women alive today have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner, and about 4.5 million women have been threatened with a gun by an intimate partner. And as we can see in the graph on the screen, there are racial disparities in this as well. Among the 25 high-income countries, America accounts for only 32% of the female population, but we account for 84% of all female firearm homicide victims. In 2015, women were 100 times more likely to be killed by a man with a gun than to use a gun in self-defense. 93% of female victims were murdered by a man they knew, which might explain why they were not able to use a gun in self-defense, because we don't often look at the people we care about and we interact with the most as being dangerous to us and to our health. 64% were wives or intimate acquaintances of the men that killed them. And when we think about the cost related to intimate partner violence, it's an estimated $8 billion a year related to the medical, mental health, and loss of productivity that domestic violence causes. So on average, we say about 13.5 million work days are lost each year. For children and teens, firearms are now the top leading cause of death. They have slowly, since 2019, moved past motor vehicles, and it continues to rise. 25% of these victims of mass shootings are also children. So if we look at Sandy Hook or Parkland or Columbine. When it comes to domestic violence, 40% of those victims are also children. It is often is the case where the father comes home and he kills his wife and then his children. And in about 16% of these children's deaths, the child mistook a gun for a toy and an accident ensued. In addition to the gun fatalities, about 6,000 children are treated for gunshot wounds every year. Most of these are boys or racial minorities. About 48% of these firearm injuries are admitted to the hospital, with 3% of these children, unfortunately, not surviving the emergency room treatment. A study published in 2020 found that the median cost of these hospital admissions was about $12,000, and these children spend about 3 days in the hospital for treatment for these injuries. Children are also more likely to be exposed to violence and crime than adults. Almost 1 in 10 American children have seen a family member assault another family member, and more than 25% have been exposed to family violence during their lifetime. A child's exposure to one type of violence increases the likelihood that that child will be exposed to other types of violence and that they will be exposed multiple times. There are racial disparities in these outcomes as well. Black men are at the highest risk for gun homicides. They are 10 times more likely than white Americans to die by gun homicide. Black women are twice as likely to be fatally shot by an intimate partner compared to white women. And Black children and teens are 15 times more likely than white children and teens of the same age to die by gun homicide. They are also more likely to be unintentionally killed by firearms than white children. But as I said earlier, the biggest risk is the increased risk of suicide. Nearly 2/3, or about 61% of all gun deaths in the United States are suicide. So we'll use 2018's numbers. In 2018, 39,740 was the total number of gun deaths. But of that, there were 24,432 gun suicides. That is more than half of all the suicides that occurred in 2018, and is a rate of 7.5 per 100,000. This means that the United States has a suicide rate 8 times that of other high-income countries, making us the second highest in the world behind Greenland. Access to a gun increases the risk of death by suicide by 3 times. This is because most people who attempt suicide do not die unless they use a gun. Now, if we look at things like gun laws, we can see the states with looser laws have higher suicide rates, and access to firearms in those states increase the likelihood of success. So nationally, the suicide rate is 14.8 per 100,000, but this varies by state, with the top 3 states being Wyoming with 25.2 per 100,000, New Mexico with 25 per 100,000, and Montana with 24.9 per 100,000. In contrast, the states with the lowest rate are New Jersey with 8.3, New York with also 8.3, and Rhode Island with 9.5. The CDC estimates that 3.7% of the US population have experienced thoughts of suicide, with 1% developing a plan and about 0.5% attempting during the previous year. Now, this translates to about 12 million people thinking about it, 3.5 million people planning for it, and 1.4 million trying. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. And so, as I mentioned, there were 48,344 suicides in 2018. And for context, there were only 36,560 motor vehicle deaths that year. Among people 15 to 34, it is the second leading cause of death. And across all groups, the most common method is suicide by firearm, as you can see here. Over half of all successful attempts use a gun. And we've seen suicide rates continue to rise over previous years. The reason guns are used is that they're more likely to result in death. Between 85 and 95% of attempts involving a gun result in death. If you compare this to intentional overdoses, which is the most often used implement, only about 2 to 3% of those are lethal. In fact, only about 5% of all other methods combined will actually result in the death of the person. There are also differences by gender. As men get older, the risk for homicide decreases, but the risk of suicide increases. And gun suicides are concentrated in states with high rates of ownership, and men and women see increases in those states. Women are more likely to think about and attempt suicide, and they account for about 75% of non-lethal suicide attempts, but men are far more likely to die from suicide. They account for 77% of the total suicides and 86% of the total firearm suicides. And as we look at the graph, we can see that for women, there's almost a perfect bell curve where it increases until they reach midlife, which is a point where many women may experience life-changing events such as the death of a partner, divorce, menopause, but then it decreases steadily with age. But for men, it nearly consistently increases with age. This could be because men do not have strong, long-lasting friendship networks, unlike women. And in that case, if they experience divorce, death, a disability, well, the graph paints a very stark idea of how they react to that. We can see when looking at the methods that men and women choose, men overwhelmingly choose a firearm, whereas women are more evenly dispersed across the types of methods that they might choose. So let's take a segue into the idea of well-being. And to start with, we will define what well-being actually is. Now, there's no single consensus around a single definition of well-being, but we can argue at minimum that is the ability to optimize one's physical, mental, and social functioning. Or to put it more simply, it is the state of being comfortable, safe, happy, and healthy. And a lot of my research falls into this area. Well-being is a positive outcome that is meaningful for people and for many sectors of society because it tells us how people perceive their lives and how they perceive their health. It includes things like good living conditions and employment. And well-being integrates mental health and physical health, giving us a more holistic approach to disease prevention and health promotion. It's considered a valid population outcome measure beyond morbidity, mortality, and economic status because it gives us the views of respondents from their own perspective. Advances in fields such as my own, like sociology, psychology, neuroscience, and measurement theory suggest that well-being can be measured with a degree of accuracy. And it is associated with higher rated self-perceived health, longevity, healthier lifestyle behaviors, reduced mental and physical illness, increased social connectedness, and more productivity. So for example, individuals with higher levels of well-being have decreased risk of illness and disease and better immune functioning, which lends itself to speedier recovery if they do get sick. They are also more productive at work and more likely to contribute to their communities. But how is that connected to guns? Well, first off, there's very little evidence to suggest that owning a gun makes us safer, as I pointed out, with the increased risk of homicide, intimate partner violence deaths, and suicides. But there are many people who actually claim that firearms provide other benefits to their owners beyond safety, that they provide things like peace of mind, freedom from fear, and contentment. But is any of this actually true? Do guns provide an emotional benefit? So, for example, does gun ownership reduce stress? When we consider implementing any public health intervention, we always have to examine the cost and benefits of these interventions. Specifically, we have to weigh the cost to the individual versus the gain to society. So if guns provide a benefit of increased well-being, we cannot ethically restrict access considering all the benefits that well-being is associated with within that society. And this is where my research comes in. So let's take a minute and just talk about that for a second. Let's look at some of the things that I've actually studied. And I've examined several measures of well-being with gun ownership, from fear, sleep, happiness, life satisfaction, to things like sexual dysfunction. So there is a rhetoric in society that suggests that people own guns because they're irrational cowards. And we see it in the news media. You can see headlines like these where they say that people buy guns because they're scared. We also see it in political advertisements: guns, the weapons of cowards, stop the lie, stop the NRA. We see it in films, movies like Friday, Rush Hour, say things like guns are for the weak, put down your guns and fight like a man, because real men do not use guns. They solve problems in other ways. We see it in comics. Batman is most famous for not using firearms. And since the first issue of his actual comic in 1941, he has equated gun use with cowardice. And most famously in the 1986 The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, he says a gun is a coward's weapon. We also see it when people are talking to each other on social media. As this person says, I always see guns as a sign of weakness. I always walk around outside unarmed because I'm not afraid, while most gun owners are fearful and need reassurance. We see it in memes. Gun violence is for cowards. Let me write you a prescription for 2 testicles. And we even see it in the work of other academics. So several people have written that if you perceive yourself at risk of victimization or you're afraid of crime, you might consider buying a gun. And if you're afraid that your neighborhood is not safe, you are more likely to own a gun. So what we wanted to do was to kind of look at, is any of this rhetoric actually true? So we looked at the Chapman Survey of American Fears, which is the most robust data set for fears collected in the United States. And we tested that against gun ownership. And what we found was that gun owners actually have less fear than non-gun owners. And you can see, I broke it down here where you can see where the fears are pulling, because in most cases, gun owners and non-gun owners were kind of the same. But you can see by the markings of the asterisks where the gun owners differed. So they were less afraid of animals, less afraid of heights, less afraid of being mugged, and less afraid of zombies. So obviously we watched too much Walking Dead, and that's led people to thinking that they can handle themselves in the zombie apocalypse. So this shows that, you know, guns do provide a benefit to well-being. So the next question then was, does this translate to other measures of well-being? Because a person who's less afraid should be able to sleep better at night. They should be healthier overall. They should be happier. They should be more satisfied with their lives. So we're going to look at all these, and I'll talk about the findings at the end. So first, there's a rhetoric that says that gun owners sleep better at night because of their guns. And you can see there's a quote that's been misattributed to both Winston Churchill and George Orwell on your screen that say people sleep peacefully in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. It was actually written for American Rifleman in the NRA magazine back in like '93, but you can go on to pretty much any NRA pro website and someone will have that in their signature and attribute it to one of the 2 men I have on the screen. And then they sell this as items to people to wear on t-shirts or babies' clothing out and about. There are also products that are related to how people could sleep with guns in their bedroom. So at the top is the pillow safe that is sold on Amazon for $69.99. It is a safe inside of a pillow so that you can sleep with a gun underneath your head. There are also more traditional safes that people can put under their beds, or you can see the device that allows the guns to be on the side of the bed, or you can just buy traditional racks to hang them up above your bed. But when we think about the dangers that are related to keeping guns that close to your bed, there are several accidents and deaths that occur every year because the gun goes off under the pillow, or in one horrible case, a small child found the gun and it went off, and killed them. So these types of behaviors aren't really safe. So we looked at this to determine whether or not gun ownership was related to better sleep quality, and we published 2 papers looking at this. In the first, we looked at neighborhood context, and in the other, we added ideas of neighborhood fear. And what we found is that there's no difference between gun owners and non-gun owners, that it's really how do you perceive your neighborhood. If you perceive your neighborhood as more dangerous, whether you have a gun or not, you do not sleep as well. There's also a rhetoric that suggests guns can make you happy. And you can see these memes. They said money can't buy happiness, but they lied because you can buy guns. All I want for Christmas is you. Just kidding. Get me guns and ammo. Let's think about what makes me happy. Things that make me happy: firearms, accessories, money for firearms, guns, they make me happy. The I like guns emojis. Happiness is a smoking gun. But just like with the sleep outcomes, what we found is that happiness is not associated with gun ownership, that gun owners and non-gun owners have similar levels of happiness. And really, it's marital status that really determines whether or not a person is happy. Married people are happier overall than unmarried people. There's also rhetoric that suggests gun ownerships can improve your life. So you can see here, thank the good Lord for all my guns. I started shooting them at a young age and my life is better for it. And then this other person during the 2020 election said it would make my life better if someone would repeal the 80% of gun laws that are unconstitutional. Can I count on the president and vice president to do that? And there are even companies called Best Life Guns that exist for the sole purpose of trying to suggest that your life would be better with a gun in it. And as with the previous papers, there is no association. The guns are not associated with having a better sense of life satisfaction. One of our more recent papers looks at whether or not guns are a compensatory device. And so what I mean by that is that many people will compare guns to penises. And you will see that there are memes and other things that say that people use them in compensation for having a small penis. So like this one, when a guy tells me he owns a gun, I'm like, what's wrong? Guns are the ultimate phallic symbol. Nothing in our society looks or even functions more like a penis than a handgun. What message are you trying to send by bringing guns to a presidential event? I have a tiny penis. Have you tried Viagra? A gun, you mean that phallic invention that insecure men use to compensate for their small penis size? Don't tell anyone, but I compensate for my small penis by stockpiling a crap load of guns. Owns an AR-15, has a 2-inch penis. And you know what they say, the bigger the gun, the smaller the penis. We even see it in instructions. This is often found in men's bathrooms, where it says, please stand closer, you're holding a pistol, not a rifle, and be sure to aim before firing. We see it in major media outlets, 8 things guns compensate for besides your penis. And another one, assault rifle owners have tiny penises. And there was a news story recently here in Florida, you can see November 2020, where a Florida man pulled a gun on a person because of a road rage incident where that person he pulled a gun on said that he had a small penis. And so he got mad and pulled a gun in that event. So as you may guess from the title, Sexual Dysfunction and Gun Ownership in America, when hard data meet a limp theory, what we found in this is that there actually is not an association between sexual dysfunction. We looked at use of Viagra, we looked at performance anxiety, and other measures to determine whether or not the gun owners would experience more of these outcomes, whether they used Viagra more, whether they had more performance anxiety, whether they had problems maintaining an erection. But we found that there actually is no connection between the two. So now when we start thinking about what can we do, right? What we should really look at first is where are gun deaths kind of concentrated? So if I were to ask all of you right now and let you answer where the most dangerous city in America is, how many of you would say Chicago or New York or LA? But if we actually look at the data, Chicago among major cities is 12th and among all cities is 28th. They're not even in the top 10. And in fact, neither is New York. New York is actually one of the safest. It's near the bottom of the top 100 cities. So let's now consider how the power that gun laws have to reduce gun deaths. Now, I want to point out before we move into this that I'm not suggesting causation. And we'll talk about why we can't say causation in a minute, but I'm going to talk about correlations that have existed since 1995. If we look at the states with the most gun deaths in order, they are Mississippi, Louisiana, Wyoming, Missouri, Alabama, and Alaska. If we compare that with the states with the fewest gun deaths, they're Hawaii, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, New York, and Connecticut. But those are all in different geospatial locations across the United States. What if we compare just states in the Northeast? So I'm going to use Vermont and Maine because they both have constitutional carry. This means as long as you're not a criminal, you can have a gun and carry it wherever you want. And we're going to compare it to New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts because they have some of the strictest gun laws in the continental US. Vermont and Maine. Vermont has a rate of 11.6 per 100,000. Maine has a rate of 10.4 per 100,000. New York is 5.3. New Jersey is 5. Massachusetts is 3.7. Vermont is nearly 4 times the rate of Massachusetts. But we hear a lot about Chicago and LA. So let's look at now Indiana, Ohio, Texas, Illinois, and California. Indiana has a rate of 17.3. Ohio has a rate of 15.2. Texas has a rate of 14.2. Illinois is 14.1. California is 8.5. So when we start thinking about how these laws can actually affect other things, most people, when they think about gun violence, they immediately begin to think about mass shootings because these get the most media attention. If we look at the role that laws play on gun violence, a study that was published in what was formerly called the British Medical Journal, now called BMJ, found that for every 10-unit increase in the permissiveness of a state gun law, there was a 9% increase in the rate of mass shootings. A 10% increase in gun ownership was also associated with a higher rate of mass shootings. So basically, the difference between states with weaker laws and states with stronger laws was increasing over time. And they took this data from the FBI's Uniform Crime Report using the definition of a mass shooting of 4 or more people, not including the shooter. But it's kind of, you can see, kind of stark there. As I mentioned earlier, Massachusetts has a rate of 3.7. Hawaii has one of the best rates in the country. In New Jersey, where are they at on this scale? They're all the way at the bottom. And then states that have the highest number of gun deaths, they're at the top of this mass shooting scale. Some final thoughts on all of this. States with stricter laws have fewer deaths related to intimate partner violence, and they have fewer deaths related to suicides. Now, for women, it only is a decrease in gun suicides. But for men, there's actually a decrease in suicide by any implement. So there are fewer suicides across the board for men. Now, as I said, I pointed out before we started talking about the laws, this is all correlational, not causational, because there's a problem that exists due to laws. And the problem that exists means that we cannot definitively say that gun laws are responsible for these effects. And it all has to do with something called the Dickey Amendment. So what is the Dickey Amendment? Well, this was a rider on the 1996 Omnibus Spending Bill. It was an amendment created by a man named Jay Dickey, who was a Republican member of the House of Representatives from the state of Arkansas. Now, this amendment was lobbied heavily by the NRA, and it was passed in response to some CDC-funded research in 1993 that showed having guns in the home were associated with an increased risk of homicide in the home. This paper was published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Dr. Arthur Kellerman and Dr. Frederick Riviera. This study was strongly associating the risks of homicide with gun ownership, and it apparently struck a nerve with the NRA, and the media began giving it widespread attention. This research was funded by the CDC's National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, and the NRA responded by demanding that the National Center for Injury Prevention be eliminated. They argued that scientists are just crazy liberals who are trying to take away gun rights, and that these scientists who are not in the employ of the NRA should not be allowed to do gun research. So that led to the passage of this bill. And what this bill did was it mandated that none of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the CDC can be used to advocate for or promote gun control. And they took away about $2.6 million from the CDC's budget the year that this was added, which was the exact amount that had been added in 1995 to do gun-related research. Now, the biggest effect of this law was that it became known as a moratorium on gun research. This is because it was interpreted as if the CDC funded research that found findings that painted guns in a negative light, the CDC would lose all federal funding immediately. And this includes funding for things like cancer or heart disease. So this kind of caused all gun research to kind of disappear in the mid-90s, which is why we don't see a lot of gun research even in public health until very recent years. Eventually, this language is also later applied to the NIH. Now, we do see in 2018 that Alex Azar kind of said that we can study guns if it's looking at it from a mental health perspective, but the caveat of the language is still there, that the NRA or other groups, if they find that the research is implying that we need gun control, they could potentially strip away funding. This is why we spend less for gun violence in this country than we do on any other cause of death except for falling. And I would argue that we kind of know how a lot of these things work, right? We know how people die from fires, yet we spend more on understanding how fires affect people than we do gun violence in this country. I'm going to stop here. I think I'm like 3 minutes early. And I'll open up to any questions.
Thank you so much, Ben. We're on a fairly tight schedule today, so I'm going to turn it over real quickly to Emma